Barron Trump adjusted his seat slightly, breaking the facade of imperturbability. His classmates, aware of his presence and lineage, glanced at him now and then, their curiosity veiled with measured restraint. He felt neither seen nor unseen, more accurately, he was adrift somewhere in between, floating in a realm that divided the personal from the public. The lecture continued, a relentless dissection of all that bore the Trump name. Professor Morgan spoke with conviction, steering clear of personal attacks but delving deeply into the moral questions each business decision posed. It's important, she emphasized, to scrutinize the difference between perceived values and actual outcomes. Barron's mind was a torrent of thoughts: loyalty to family, the quest for truth, and his own identity. He was absorbing the critical voices like a sponge, yet sifting through them cautiously, discarding those that seemed hollow. Finally, a hand rose from the back, an unassuming student with an air of stern curiosity. "Professor," he began, "how do we differentiate between a strategic move and a manipulative one, especially when outcomes are subjective and perspectives diverse?" Professor Morgan paused, scanning the room, and her eyes flickered towards Barron for the briefest moment. "It's not just perspective," she replied, "it's about consequences, intentions, and the courage to own them." Barron, remaining calm, absorbed her words, feeling them echo in his thoughts. They reminded him of something his father once said about the nature of success and the inevitable scrutiny it invites. As the class drew to a close, Barron lingered, hoping to speak briefly with Professor Morgan. He approached her, hesitating momentarily. "Thank you," he said, "no more, no less." She nodded, understanding more in his silence than words could convey. He left the room, a slight breeze from the opening door accompanying his departure, and with him left the unspoken promise of forging his own path in the shadows of a legacy both heavy and illustrious. Barron raised his hand, capturing the attention of the entire room, transforming a lesson into an arena. The teacher, surprised yet curious, gave him the floor by pronouncing his name with a mix of professional neutrality and intellectual challenge: "Mr. Trump?" He stood up, calmly placed his notebook on the desk, took a breath, and spoke with determined softness, precise articulation, and quiet strength. He thanked the teacher for her frankness, acknowledging that figures like his father should be scrutinized, criticized, analyzed. Barron wished to offer another perspective, not to excuse, but to complement. Behind the mistakes, contradictions, and provocations, there was a willingness to dare, to take risks in a system that is often cynical, where success doesn't always align with ethics. He spoke of resilience, invisible pressures, and real dilemmas faced by decision-makers under the spotlight. He questioned the class: if you had been in his place, would you have done better? Would you have resisted all temptations? Or made similar compromises? His words resonated like an invitation to move beyond binary judgment, to understand the human complexity behind public figures. His posture, both humble and courageous, shifted his classmates' attention from skepticism to sincere listening. They understood that this young man was not blindly defending, but embodying a call to think more deeply, to place ethics in a context of real choices, concrete ambiguities, where one never knows in advance if one is acting for good, or simply to survive. And when Professor Morgan, ever so lively, asked him if he believed his father had always acted ethically, he replied bluntly, "No," provoking a wave of astonishment and respect. For this raw honesty, coming from the son, was worth all the theoretical demonstrations, restoring to ethics its true dimension. That of an inner struggle, an effort of lucidity, a commitment not to turn a blind eye to one's own contradictions. From that moment on, something changed in the room, as if Barron's words had created a bridge between two worlds, that of academic discourse and that of lived experience. This tension between critical distance and personal involvement gave the class a rare intensity, which lingered long after the session ended, as the students, initially silent, then slowly approaching, came to him to discuss, debate, and understand. For daring to say what they would never have imagined hearing from a Trump. In the courtyard, as the leaves fell slowly and the campus gradually emptied, a young woman approached him, hesitant, and said, "I don't agree with everything you said, but you made me think." And in this simple exchange lay the full significance of his intervention. It was not the defense of a name, but the attempt to rehumanize a debate too often reduced to caricatures, to show that ethics, far from being a fixed code, is an inner journey made of doubts, confrontations, constant revisions. And that sometimes, it is those we least expect, those who remain in the shadows, who have the courage to say what is essential. Thus, that day, in an ethics class like any other, Barron Trump, with his calm voice, nuanced thought, and personal commitment, had sown a rare seed, that of a true debate, where opinions do not clash in noise, but meet in respect, complexity, and listening. Almost meditative, a sense of inner coherence that he had rarely felt throughout his life, burdened as it was by a name so heavy as his. As he walked towards the cobblestone courtyard of the campus, hands in the pockets of his dark wool coat, his gaze lifted to the orange and gray-tinged Manhattan sky, as if the world itself held its breath. Waiting to see what he would do with this new aura of legitimacy he had managed to conquer not by force, but by reason. The following days were marked by a subtle yet profound change in his daily life. In the hallways, the once curious or fearful glances had turned attentive, respectful, sometimes even admiring. And some students he only knew by name began to approach him, no longer with veiled judgments or insinuations, but with a sincere desire to understand his perspective, to debate, to learn. Thus, one day, after a particularly dense class on the tax evasion mechanisms and multinationals, she invited him to lunch at a small intellectual cafe in the neighborhood. A cozy place where the walls were adorned with Latin quotes and where silence was only broken by the clinking of porcelain cups on saucers. There, facing her, Barron calmly and clearly developed his own vision of entrepreneurial ethics. He spoke of the tension between family loyalty and intellectual independence, the necessity of designing business models where the pursuit of profit could not be dissociated from social responsibility. He even mentioned the idea of a personal project, an interdisciplinary reflection platform combining philosophy, economics, and politics, aimed at fostering authentic debates among students from all backgrounds on contemporary dilemmas. Morgan, initially silent, listened to him for a long time before placing her hand on the cup and telling him, in an almost solemn tone, that few students had ever surprised her so much, not by their eloquence, but by their sincerity. This recognition, discreet yet profound, was a turning point for Barron. He then understood that his voice could matter, that his name, far from being merely a burden, could become a tool, a key to access intellectual spaces where few dared to tread. In the weeks that followed, he intensified his participation in class, speaking up in seminars on market regulation, the moral limits of artificial intelligence applied to high-frequency trading, and the information asymmetries between elites and civilian populations. But it was during a university conference on the ethics of truth in political communication that his transformation became striking. Invited by one of his professors to be part of a panel alongside former diplomats, renowned economists, and philosophers from NYU and Columbia. He accepted, not without apprehension, but with the firm intention of not betraying the intellectual stance he had forged. On the day, dressed simply, his face impassive yet focused, he stood before a full room and delivered a brilliant speech. Blending Kantian reflections and pragmatic analyses, he denounced both populist excesses and the hypocrisies of progressive elites. Calling for a new form of political lucidity based on the responsibility of all social actors, his speech, of unexpected density, first provoked silence, then a thunderous applause, not for what he represented, but for what he had said. It was there, in that suspended moment, that he felt for the first time that he was no longer simply his father's son. He had become a serious interlocutor, an emerging thinker, and perhaps, a man capable of opening a space where ideological opposites could finally engage in dialogue. From then on, invitations multiplied, filmed debates among students, publications in student journals of applied ethics, participation in an internal committee for reforming the curricula at the Stern School. One winter evening, a handwritten letter he received from a retired professor from Princeton, who had seen him on YouTube, proposed a philosophical correspondence on the great dilemmas of the 21st century. While this intense rhythm could have intoxicated any young man, Barron kept a cool head, driven not by the need for recognition, but by a nearly silent desire to build something that belonged to him, something authentic. Deep down, He knew that the challenge would be constant, that the name Trump still evoked and would always evoke visceral reactions, that nothing would be granted to him without him having to earn it 1,000 times more than anyone else. It was precisely in this very difficulty that he saw his mission, to prove that ethics was not a luxury, nor a facade, but a requirement of lucidity and courage, and that it could transform the most controversial legacies into springboards for collective reflection. In this Manhattan crackling with ideas, between libraries with fogged windows, late-night debates in student cafes, and long solitary walks through the streets of Greenwich Village, Barron Trump gradually traced a path that was no longer the one imagined for him, but the one he chose. And yet, while the growing recognition from his peers, the density of his commitments, and the sophistication of his reflections seemed to open the doors to an autonomous intellectual trajectory, Barron Trump felt a new tension rising within him, a more subtle, deeper inner conflict than anything he had faced before. It was no longer the external pressure of the name, nor the overwhelming shadow of his father, nor even the critical gaze of the academic public. It was the vertigo of responsibility, the weight of a role he had never asked for but could no longer escape. For as the eyes turned to him not as a symbol, but as an actor in contemporary thought, the solicitations became more serious, heavier, more decisive. He was invited to speak at think tanks, to participate in working groups on new digital regulations, offered columns in serious media like The Atlantic or The New Yorker. Above all, something he had never imagined, some influential professors began to mention his name for future doctoral research programs blending political ethics, business law, and moral philosophy. Moreover, in the most discreet corridors of the university, some whispered that he could one day become a political voice, a mediating figure capable of reconciling the ideological fractures of his country. Barron heard this murmur without ever fully embracing it, for while he knew himself to possess a clear-sighted perspective and a sincere desire to understand, he deeply doubted his legitimacy to embody such a role. He refused to yield to the temptation of heroism, aware that any messianic posture was merely an ego trap, and yet, a series of events would hasten this slow ascent into the light into a true inner trial. One autumn day, as the russet leaves fell like unresolved questions on the campus sidewalks, a visiting professor from Yale, there for a lecture on contemporary cynicism and political communication, launched a sharp ironic remark about former President Trump, provoking laughter in the amphitheater. The air was heavy with anticipation as Barron, the figure of recent discourse, sat calmly at the center of the vast conference hall. His presence incited whispers and exchanges, a ripple of curiosity brushing through scholars and students alike, ready to dissect his words in real time. Despite the softening lights and the encroaching silence that cocooned the room, Barron remained tranquil, a man poised on the precipice of another defining moment. Standing by his principles had brought him here, and the world watched, waiting. His earlier viral confrontation had unveiled the layers of academic decorum versus public perception, swirling Barron into a reluctant spotlight. As he faced the auditorium with an introspective visage, Barron was aware that today's discussion was more than just a debate. The discussion on inheriting power, between guilt, responsibility, and emancipation was an opportunity to shape dialogues beyond the university walls. He embraced the challenge, knowing each word would echo in halls of criticism and corridors of acclaim. The questions were sharp, some like daggers probing for a falter, a slip into rashness. Yet, Barron's demeanor was unyielding, his responses woven with insights rooted in the teachings of the past. He invoked the wisdom of Hannah Arendt on power and responsibility, highlighted Rawls' justice theory, invoked Simone Weil's thoughts on force, and channeled Baldwin's eloquence on the human condition. His arguments formed a tapestry of thought, each thread a testament to intellectual resilience. Critics attempted to pigeonhole him, and adversaries sought weaknesses, but Barron's consistency was unshakable. He spoke without seeking the limelight, engaged without the need to dominate, imparted knowledge without the intent to indoctrinate. In doing so, he embodied a narrative of thoughtful engagement. At the conclusion of the session, as Barron prepared to leave the podium, the room remained in reflective silence. His voice had neither boomed nor subdued, it had resonated, striking chords in individual reflections. The applause, when it came, was a gradual, respectful symphony, a recognition of intellect unmarred by ideology, of a mind not swayed but steady. Barron left the stage, unaware of the multitude he had inspired, the dialogues he had birthed, and the silent resolve he had kindled in those who felt the weight of inherited power, now just a little lighter. And this intervention, praised for its clarity and depth, became the decisive turning point. From then on, he was no longer spoken of merely as the son of but as a distinct, original voice, capable of thinking beyond his history, transforming it, and opening it up to others. In the months that followed, he continued his studies with unwavering rigor, but also launched, as he had planned, an interdisciplinary journal called Ethos, where students, researchers, and professionals from around the world contributed to deconstructing contemporary grand narratives. The journal enjoyed unexpected success, translated into several languages, adopted as a teaching tool in some international seminars, and Barron, while remaining discreet, was regularly invited to give lectures at institutions ranging from sciences to Stanford. It was in this context that one day, after a debate on algorithmic governance, he received a brief message, signed by a hand he knew well. "I listened to you. You made me think. Call me Dad." This message, more than all the others, shook him, not because he sought paternal validation, but because he realized, at that precise moment, that his words had managed to break through the walls of caricature, reaching a heart, even that of his father. He simply replied, "Thank you. We will talk. But later. I am writing right now." And thus ended this first chapter of his intellectual life, not with a media apotheosis, not with a conquest of power, but with a silent fidelity to an inner task. That task was of thinking rightly, speaking truthfully, and not betraying that spark of clarity he had found within himself one day, in a crowded amphitheater at NYU, while he defended not his father, but the complexity of reality. Through this demanding, solitary yet fruitful path, Barron Trump had become, not a role model, nor a leader, nor a prodigy, but a man, a free man.